It may seem odd when you think about it that going through adolescence we are constantly told that our brains are still developing, and yet we have already mastered one of the most complex parts of human nature: language. Many animals communicate through some form of language, but none come close to being as sophisticated as any of ours. So how is it we are able to learn it at such a young age? There is thought to be a critical period for learning, which, according to the second edition of Psychological Science by Michael Gazzaniga and Todd Heatherton, is a developmental period during which young animals are best able to learn specific skills and knowledge. This was originally hypothesized by Eric Lindbergh, who believed that if these skills and knowledge are not acquired during this critical period, then they cannot be acquired at a later point. Researchers had a hard time studying this, however, until they came across a girl in 1970 they named Genie. Genie was around 13 years old and had been neglected her whole life, locked in a room by her mentally ill father, either tied to a chair or caged in her crib, with no one to talk to and nothing to listen to. When she was discovered, she knew very few words and had little interest in connecting with anybody. She even had a very strange gait, described like a rabbit with her hands held out in front of her like paws. With Genie, researchers got to see the results of an experiment no one with any hint of a moral or ethical code would have dared to try, and that is finding out what human nature really is when completely stripped of society and culture. How much of our speech and character traits are hardwired into our genes, and how much is a result of early child experience. After years of teaching her, Genie was only able to learn the most rudimentary language skills. She was able to comprehend words just fine. In fact, she gained a much larger vocabulary way faster than anybody had anticipated. But she could not form sentences due largely to her not being exposed to language early in life. Susan Curtis, a professor of linguistics at UCLA, describes how learning words and learning a language are two completely different things. This is from a 2002 documentary on TLC called Wild Child: The Story of Feral Children.
We seized this wonderful opportunity that she provided us in as loving a way as we could, but using it to finally get our chance to address head-on specific hypotheses and notions about human language and the human mind.
These hypotheses were based on the latest ideas about how children's brains developed. According to the theory, young children could only learn certain things at certain times, called critical periods. Language was one of these critical periods, and according to the theory, Genie, who was now a teenager, had missed her chance forever. But incredibly, Genie seemed to be proving the theory wrong. As this footage shows, Genie was blossoming. Not only was she delighted by the world around her, but she was learning the words for the new things she was seeing.
She was extremely interested in everything around her. She wanted to know the word for everything around her. She wanted to engage people all around her. And as she began to learn more and more words, hundreds of words, much more rapidly than I ever imagined, and stringing them together, I began to think maybe I will be wrong. Maybe she will be the one that will prove that this hypothesis is incorrect.
But Genie could not escape the effects of her past so easily. She was still haunted by her traumatic upbringing, trapped by the memories of the awful fate she had suffered. And linguistically, she had stopped making progress.
She learned tons of words. She has an enormous vocabulary. But language is not words. Language is grammar. Language is sentences.
That Genie was able to learn language at all shows that this period, thought to be before the age of 12 for language, may not be as rigid as previously thought, though still pretty important seeing as she was only able to learn a limited amount. What was thought to be a critical period is now seen as more of a sensitive period. Gaining knowledge is still possible even after the peak learning period has passed, even if it may be less efficient. So we know what happens to somebody's ability to learn language outside of this sensitive period. But what if people were at the perfect stage in development to learn and had a community around them, but just had no basis of language to learn from? Well, as it turns out, they just invent their own. In the early 1980s, the government of Nicaragua opened up a vocational school for deaf students, bringing together children who had been using simple and underdeveloped signs to communicate with their parents. Before this time, the deaf population of Nicaragua had little contact with one another, as they often just stayed at home, and when they were schooled, it was usually with those with developmental disabilities, and as a result, many were illiterate. They were never able to take advantage of that sensitive period because the deaf children never encountered anybody else with the same disability, and as a result, many lived in isolation, much like Genie. As the students got together for the first time, educators tried to teach them an already established sign language, but the students preferred to communicate in their own way. Their way of communicating evolved until it had become more sophisticated than the instructors could have believed. It wasn't until 1986, when linguist Judy Kegel was invited to Nicaragua to consult with these schools, that anybody realized these students had developed not a way of translating Spanish into signs, but their own language based on their own individual signs. Here she is talking about it from the episode The Mind's Big Bang from the PBS documentary series Evolution.
I came down thinking wherever there were deaf people, there was a sign language, and that obviously there would be a full-blown sign language in full swing here in Nicaragua. And I said, well, you know, I can learn a bit of their sign language if that's what you want, and work with you on learning it. They said, no, they don't have a sign language. They have mimicas. They have mime gestures. And they pointed to a group of kids and said, we want to know what they're talking about.
It turned out they were talking about a lot more than anyone dreamed possible. Kegel had arrived in Nicaragua shortly after the birth of a new language.
Language needs company. Language needs a community. Language needs some sort of a trigger.
That trigger when the students first got together was the rudimentary signs they had been using to communicate with their own families. That first generation of students were outside the peak of the sensitive period, so, like Genie, they communicated with very basic language. It was when the next generation of students came along with the building blocks of this new language already in place that they were able to refine and expand it, because they were learning it at the right age for proper language development.
While many species can communicate, even vocalize, only human languages are driven by complex rules. Every one of our world's 6,300 languages has them. We call them syntax. In her isolation, Mary No Name never encountered syntax, but it is commonplace in the children's language.
Syntax isn't the set of rules that you learned in your third grade grammar that you had to memorize so you spoke English the way you're supposed to. Syntax is, or language, the constraints on language are something that all human beings share. They're the constraints that are imparted to us by the fact that we share a single human brain. They are not just the constraints, but the ability to hierarchically organize information. I can sheerly communicate for communication's sake when I have syntax. Then I can truly use a language.
Nicaraguan Sign Language today is just as sophisticated as other languages. It has syntax, grammar, and follows many rules of other languages even though the students were never taught them. These students had two advantages over Genie that allowed them to create and learn a complex language. One was they had an early enough start, and two, they had a culture and a community around them they could learn from. Coming together as school children and even learning how to communicate basic things with their parents before that was important, as they at least had an understanding of what language was, something Genie did not know. It's that combination of having company while in a sensitive period that allows all humans to learn language. If you have company and support and teachers but are out of the sensitive period like Genie was later in life, it will be very hard to learn language. Likewise, if someone is in the sensitive period but doesn't have a community or language to learn from, like the Nicaraguan children before the schools for the deaf opened, but given a community to work with and the right time in the brain's development, and we could learn something as complex as a language, even if there wasn't much of one to begin with.